Hey there, I'm Doug. I wrote The Guardsman under the pen name R.G. Taark. We are going into episode number 31. This is The Guardsman, Book 3. We are into chapters 74 through 75 today, and it's that one right there. Please sit back, enjoy, hit that like, subscribe, and comment button. Love to hear from you, and if you really like it, there should be a link for it down in the bottom if you want to take a look in more detail. See you on the other side.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 31, Chapters 74 through 75. Chapter 74. Persephone was becoming more and more amused as she followed Captain Lobo through several galleries and grand halls. He had obviously been told to take the long way to wherever she was being taken. They had already made a long parabola around the functional areas of the upper palace and dropped several floors by the long graceful public stairs instead of the direct and central family elevators and corridors. She was greeted by murmurs from her celebrity status that had grown to amazing proportions after Friday night's vidcast fireworks. Persephone could tell the mood was generally stale and anxious, but there was no need to allow herself to feel the doldrums. She enjoyed the smiles and attention from the various visitors and functionaries as she ambled behind the stoically marching Captain Lobo. They passed a series of rooms as she was guided through the main entry and reception hall before turning right down a wide side corridor. Between the middle and last door, blocking the corridor, stood 3 more guardsmen in white with their heavy assault gauss snugly harnessed over their pristine duty uniforms. Their conversation was hushed, but died completely as she turned into the corridor, and they stepped aside. That hush, and that they were outside the room, was not a good sign. Persephone wanted to cringe in expectation, but forced a gently relaxed smile instead. She greeted her mother's guards by name as she passed, but they only nodded silently as she passed directly to the last room, and she felt her trepidation grow. The automated door silently opened, anticipating Captain Lobo, so Persephone followed. Her mother sat alone behind the room's low table, with 3 silver platters of finger foods spaced perfectly before her. The comfortably arranged room was centered to collect the light from the far wall's large picture window framing the cityscape and bustling traffic. The window was centered perfectly behind her mother, illuminating the entire setting in perfect afternoon sunlight. Captain Lobo abruptly made 2 marching turns to the right and went out the door without a word. Celine's perfectly schooled and steady right hand stirred the tea in her cup, while her left thumb pinched the tea bags stringed to the saucer. When Persephone looked back from the closing door at her mother, Celine didn't even bother to look up from her slowly moving spoon. Her face was placid, but the muscle on the left side of her jaw clenched repeatedly. Instead of speaking as her left hand cradled the teacup saucer, Celine's right pinky finger flicked from the still stirring spoon, indicating the empty chair to her right. Persephone moved silently and sat in the indicated chair. She allowed a moment more to pass with her mother silently stirring her tea, watching the ripples, before Persephone spoke softly to break the silence. Spanakopita. My favorite. I haven't had them in ages. I hope some of them are spinach and cheese. Celine eyed her and then snapped. Persephone Apollonia, her mother's level and emotionless use of her full given name stopped her nervous babbling instantly. Stop your noise. Her mother's regal poise didn't waver a second as she smoothly lifted the silver spoon from her teacup, and in her trademarked preservation of both cup and silver, she deftly tipped the spoon on its side and slid the edge out of the cup, pulling the drops of tea from the spoon. Persephone knew it drove her mother insane when barbarous cretins whacked her silverware against her delicate 2-century-old china, chipping her priceless china and marring the finished edges on her delicate and paper-thin silver serving pieces. As the last of her tea drained from the spoon, She righted it and laid it perfectly across the top of her saucer, allowing the tea bag to steep in the hot water. Celine exhaled slowly through her nose before speaking calmly. Persephone Apollonia, you have no idea how furious I am with you right now. Persephone knew better than to speak or move during Celine's pause, so she did neither. Celine ground out slowly. I asked for tea only for myself. The staff took the initiative by providing food service. Don't think in your arrogance for 1 second that they prepared those treats for you. I asked for tea less than 10 minutes ago, and fresh spanakopita takes 45 minutes to cook. Never mind cool, prepare for service, or the required delivery time to this room. You would know that yourself if you ever bothered to pay attention to a single word. I have told you about planning and coordinating events. Celine deftly lifted her teacup from the saucer, allowing the tea bag's string to slide from her finger and fall against the cup, where her long-practiced right index finger trapped it in place as she demurely sipped. She exhaled in modest satisfaction while replacing the cup on the saucer. She pinched the spoon and removed the tea bag, carefully draining it and replacing the spoon on the saucer with the drained bag still in the spoon. Her fingers smoothly disposed of the string and draped it over the spoon as Celine considered her next words. Celine's rebuke kept Persephone silent and small. Mother or not, the woman was just intimidating. Persephone Apollonia, I know that man, her mother obviously referring to Samson, does and will do anything you tell him. So I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was your idea to invade my personal space. You are also fully knowledgeable about the complexity and demanding nature of my schedule on a normal day. You are also fully aware that these last have been anything but normal days. You are also fully aware that I am lightheaded and uncomfortable from substantial loss of blood so recently. This coincidentally is probably why at every scheduled, and now impromptu, event I have attended over the last 24 hours, there has been food service of some kind. You are also intimately aware of exactly where I like to go and what I like to do in my fantastically rare free time. You acted deliberately and disrespectfully to me personally by invading my space. Your callous personal insults this afternoon aside, we do need to talk about important matters. I expect you to answer honestly because I demand that from you unconditionally. Is that understood, daughter? Persephone felt that shamed knot at the back of her throat and could hardly speak. Yes, mother. Celine snapped coolly. Good. She took a gently relaxed sip of her tea while Persephone waited for her to finish. Celine asked calmly when she replaced her teacup, Do you love him? Persephone felt herself blink a few times in shock at the obvious stupidity of the question, before she realized just how important it actually was. My sun rises and sets with him. Celine knocked and jostled her spoon, nearly dropping the cup and spilling her tea in a flare of unbridled rage. She snapped harshly, Persephone Apollonia, you know damn well that that is what I say about your father. Don't you dare mock me right now, or I will make your life a living hell you will never escape from for the rest of your days. You have cost this family enough as it is, without you salting the wound by adding insults to the multitude of injuries you have caused. Celine exhaled roughly through her nose, visibly regained control, and settled her hands with the teacup to her lap before asking again, I say again, daughter, do you love him? Persephone felt her chest collapsing as she struggled to choke back her tears. I love him with everything that I am. Celine scolded for a second time, without remorse for Persephone's obviously sunken demeanor. Do you realize the kind of problems you are causing for us, young lady? Persephone muttered clearly, Yes. Celine pressed the obvious. You could destroy our house with your little stunt. You may even unhinge the empire our ancestors built molded and seized over the last 3 centuries and bring about civil war. You know that? You have known that for many months. You have spoken about it with your father before he sent you out. Now granted, at the time we were more worried about the immediately pressing issue of keeping you alive rather than any later ramifications. But now we seem to be over that first hurdle, and those ugly ramifications are staring us all in the face. We have merely jumped from one crisis to the next. Persephone sighed miserably. I know, and I can't help it. Selene felt a pang of pity for her daughter before quickly squashing it and demanding an answer to the horrific hypothetical. What would you have done if that brute Alexios had killed Samson? Where would you be then? Persephone sat up straight, her face hardening with resolve. I would have died. The mother in Selene scoffed at what had to have been her child's fancy. Persephone, this isn't some child's game we're playing. Don't act so glib. Persephone's eyes flashed to instantly anger as she lunged forward in her seat from what Selene realized was genuine conviction, before she snapped. I'm not. I would have killed that bastard myself with every round but the last in Samson's pistol, and then I would have put it in my mouth. I would have pulled the trigger and died next to Samson. Selene was stunned. You're saying that like you actually mean it. Persephone sat straight, calm, and level with the other woman while she spoke clearly and honestly. I do. I can't live without him. I get physically hurt when I'm not near him. Now it was Selene's turn to be unsure for a change. She even fiddled with the teaspoon as she looked down at the forgotten liquid and mumbled. That sounds serious. Persephone asked incredulously and unshakingly. You thought that I was joking? Selene looked up at her demanding daughter and spoke with resignation. No, I suppose not. But it sounds like a drug addiction you are suffering from. Persephone shrugged casually. I guess I am. I don't care about anything or anyone but Samson. Selene scoffed with a delicate smile, trying to redirect the conversation from its desperately macabre turn. Persephone, now you're sounding like you're developing a codependent personality disorder, and you. Persephone cut her off with another shrug and replied over her mother's words, I guess I am. Persephone continued casually, We have our moments, but I wouldn't want to live any more if anything happened to him. The thought of not having him in my life is devastating to me. Just thinking and talking about it makes my chest hurt. Selene was silent for a moment before the monosyllabic response. Oh, slipped out. Chapter 75. If he had hair longer than a centimeter on the top of his head, Samson would be ripping it out. He longed for a large clunky field phone, a piece of technology that had existed largely unchanged since before humanity even dreamed of space flight. It was suitably rugged, reliable, and cheap that it could be hauled around on campaign in the most brutal environments. The things were designed to be used, abused, and discarded easily if need be. It also carried the added benefit of being so thickly built and ruggedly engineered that he could slam the earpiece onto the cradle like a hammer to kill the connection. His thin work comm, and even more delicate personal comm units, would never endure that type of treatment without cracking the frame or shattering the screen. Granted, the handheld portable comms were so cheap that everyone on the planet had one, but still, his teeth ground and his fingers shook as he was forced to demurely press the touchscreen's disconnect button instead of punching his whole fist through his desktop screen controls. The office comm tied neatly into the desk itself, in a slick little port that was so snug that it made nearly no mark on the desk surface. It was conveniently ergonomically placed so that the seated occupant could keep working with his right hand, using a left thumb to pop the handheld comm out of the desktop. The thing was run from both the unit itself and a handsome little applet on the expansive desktop touchscreen work area that duplicated the comm's controlling functions. The miracle of modern convenience was contrived so that they were on both the hand unit and displayed with easy-to-use scaling, and the desktop interface had long since automatically adjusted to the current occupant's individual hand size. He felt his jaw muscles twitch under the pressure of pulling opposing teeth against one another. With a shaking left hand, he snapped the comm back into its desktop charging cradle and then curled both hands into fists and cracked his knuckles and wrists brutally. How are these people so stupid? He growled his anger and frustration in an animalistic sound after loosening his jaw with his strained speech. He felt the vein in the side of his head throb as both hands closed around the lip of his desk and squeezed in frustration. He kept wishing that it was that last CO's neck. He squeezed until his knuckles ran white and his knuckles popped again, and some minimal frustration drained out loud, to no one in his expansive but empty office. I'm not going to change a bloody guardsman assigned to protection duty because he doesn't match your bloody wife's new matching purse and private air car. He had so much crap in his hard copy inbox that he literally couldn't put his fingers into the bottom of the box and touch the top of the pile with his wrist. That, of course, excluded the growing piles of stuff that were sprouting up in not even piles, more like spreading mounds, around the once expansive and clean surface of his desk around his functional touch screen. He was buried like some clerk under so much paperwork that he was fast approaching the point of not remembering what color his desktop actually was under all the clutter. And that was just the hard copy nonsense. It was even worse in his digital inbox. He was getting to the point where he was praying for someone to call for a mind-numbing meeting somewhere so he could have an excuse to leave the creeping mess. He'd almost trade the hour or two of unproductive boredom that a meeting offered if he could just pretend that the pile wouldn't get larger while he was gone. Every time he went to a meeting, the mess on his desk got worse and deeper. It was like some sort of magical waking nightmare that chewed on his frayed patience and buried and sucked him ever downward under its level, like digital and paper quicksand. It was only a few minutes past 11 in the morning, and he'd already logged 6 solid hours, unmoving and trapped, behind his desk. The little twerp in his outer office had entered and exited 3 times already, stealing the precious few things he'd actually gotten done from his outbox and replacing them with several times that amount of new material in his inbox. The frustration was compounded by the calm lines clogged with idiocy from every moron CEO, VP, and debutant with a guardsman protection detail calling his direct line. He listened to one snippy little idiot whining about how her guardsman had scared her yappy dog when he jumped and recoiled after the thing had bit him on the ankle, drawing blood from his guardsman. To make it worse, while that silly conversation was going on, that annoying individual outside his door had brought the first load of renewed paperwork. The additional pile had thumped into his inbox just as he'd snapped, "I'll tell him to wear boots and not step on your yappy dog." The jerk had actually had the gall to smile at Samson's frustration as he stole the thin pile of finished documents from his outbox. Samson literally wanted to kill something, or just beat someone so badly that his fists hurt to the point of bleeding his frustration. On top of all that, he hadn't worked out in over a week and a half. While spending every day in the office, seated and sedentary, he was hardly eating a thing if he remembered to eat at all, and yet his waistline was feeling tight under his belt and his arms weak. It was a ridiculous paradox that was nagging at the back of his mind like a termite. How he could be eating less and getting fatter was intuitively nonsensical. He knew he was deliberately not thinking about what caused that to happen. He was doing something wrong, and he knew it. He didn't know what he was doing wrong in his new job. He just knew he was doing it wrong. Philip Kroinos presided over the hegemony's power generation as CEO, plus all three major military arms, the research division, and a number of other pet project corporations, and for a long time was the Guardsman's high commander. Sure, he had delegated some of those tasks to his brother, but everything that needed his signature still got signed and sent out on time, and his desk was always clear and clean. Samson looked around at the frustrating topography of rolling hills and mountains that was modeled on his desktop, depicting some unfamiliar land. His military vision even captured units maneuvering through those hills and valleys around the placid square lake of the screen at their core. His mind saw the fighting and maneuvering to gain an advantage over one another in the hills and key terrain that paperwork offered. Maneuvers and attacking thrusts played through until a new flurry of messages crashed into his screen, distracting him from his daydream and drawing a groan. He smashed his thumb to them and dragged the clump of messages forward. Not one of them was interesting or something he wanted to deal with. 5 of them were irritatingly involved and would require attention to untangle. 20 of them were useless time-wasting messages. 8 of them were actually important and deliberately frustrating in themselves because they either unwound work he'd done earlier in the week with changing events or were messages requiring additional attention to problems he'd thought he'd already solved. His frustration spiked and Samson flicked each of the messages into either his deletion folder or any of his hundreds of shuffled stacks of messages that were scattered around the desktop into loose clumps for later review. He felt his upper left lip curl back from his teeth in frustration and irritation, as he mumbled nonsensically to himself about the damning paperwork and where he'd like to shove it. He heard the nearly silent whisk of the smoothly tuned automatic door to his office as it slid open. His eyes snapped up full of thunderheads at the interruption. Instead, Persephone stopped short just after the door slipped closed behind her. With a tiny recoil and question in her eyes, she asked concerned, "What's wrong?" He groused, "Nothing. Don't worry about it," as she resumed her walking pace around the side of his desk. Without stopping or pausing, she gently pressed her knee to the arm of his chair, at the same time pushing him slightly back in the smooth run of the wheels and turning him slowly until he partially faced her. She stepped over his leg that he'd allowed to drag behind as she turned the chair so she could sit in his lap. Without a preamble, she simply informed him, "You're lying to me? You said you'd never do that." Frustrated, he grumbled, "I didn't mean it that way." She demanded softly, "Then what did you mean?" He knew he'd be unable to escape, so there was no point trying. She'd get her answers because she was by nature more patient than he was with that type of thing. He just let his frustration spill out of his mouth. "I don't know. I'm just buried. I'm so far beyond my depth that I feel like I'm drowning in all this stupid paperwork. I go from a line unit trigger puller with standard personnel and requisition style paperwork to a bodyguard and secret lover with no paperwork whatsoever, and into the depths of pariah and untouchable status, to military VP over the Guardsman." His frustration spiked at the inane. "Baby, you have no idea how much food is shipped every day to the Academy alone. It's absolutely ridiculous. We almost measure the deliveries by the ton. I had no idea that we have almost 2 infantry divisions worth of candidates, teachers, guardsmen, administrators, and support personnel in the Academy section of the building alone. All that, and never mind that there are thousands of newly commissioned and veteran guardsmen in training and medical rehabilitation in the upper levels, plus all their support staff and administrators too. I went from sneaking around in garbage dumps, looking for single discarded scraps of paper to use as clues for Mario's detective agency, to being buried in a volume of information that I could never hope to sort in a million years. let alone the gods of war have seen fit to drop in my lap the screaming hot potato of for-hire guardsman assignments, which is purely an administrative paperwork shuffle that only requires my individual attention and approval for each and every single one of them down to the compatibility of hair color between my assigned guardsman and whatever snobby debutante Richie Rich CO's society wife I'm assigning him to because he needs to look good in. Vid captures for charity balls and brainless chat shows of all things. She leaned back against his right arm as it draped over the arm of his chair, just looking at him. She blinked twice, and the modest curiosity didn't diminish, so she asked, already knowing the answer, "I take it you had a complaint?" Samson snorted and scoffed with a tiny laugh. "Yes, I've had a complaint." "You could say that, yes. I had no idea that those jerks all had direct lines to me now. But I think they get their jollies from bossing me around." He could see the gears in her head working behind her reinvigorated eyes. She then asked with a coy smile, "Didn't they see our docu-drama 3 Friday nights ago?" While she smiled at her joke, Samson groaned and answered honestly, to the best of his knowledge, or in this case guess, "Yes, apparently they have, and it's only whetted their appetite for me. They seem to take that as an invitation to flex their own prowess in my face. They figure if they can cow the first gladiator that they must be big men indeed." She raised an eyebrow, and a little of her old fun and feisty nature returned as she actually smiled and asked, "Frustrating?" He groaned and surrendered, conceding his own inevitable defeat on the subject. "You can't imagine. I've had 3 calls like that this morning, and every single one of them I've wanted to reach through the screen and snap their heads off their shoulders at the neck." She actually bit her lip and strangled a chuckle in her throat as she obviously envisioned the callous act he'd just described. With a mirth-filled shake of her head, her smile finally exploded back onto her face. She was plainly struggling not to laugh. "I see." His frustration exploded and peeled the smile off her face. "I'm not ready for this Persephone. I'm happy hacking bad guys into little pieces. This paperwork thing has me overwhelmed for the first time in my life." She soothed. "Daddy had his brother and a staff to help him. You haven't even started with anything like that. Maybe you're just taking too big a chunk all at once. You're trying to be a paperwork hero doing it all by yourself, and you need to find some people to work with to make it happen." He missed the important point at the time, but instead answered with a continued gale of frustration, "Your dad is too busy to hold my hand. He might keep that desk of his clear, but that's because he hides everything in his drawers when people show up. The only person here I could ask for pointers about how to handle all this crap is Reese. I either outrank everyone else, or they wouldn't know what I'm talking about half the time." Persephone cringed at the mention of her snubbed betrothed and only muttered, "Ah, and you can't go to him because me." She still fretted about Rees, who was currently an opened and festering wound in the palace and at the head of their military corporation. The troops were fanatically loyal to him, and only his quiet assurances of duty and time to sort things out from the mess that Thanadios and Casimir had created was staving off the potential for a military coup. The X factor was Samson and Persephone's equally fanatical following among the hegemony's populace and soldiers. From a purely pragmatic perspective, those incalculable loyalties made planning a coup or schism of any kind extremely difficult, and shackled the brilliant general in place regardless of his personal ambitions and potential. On top of the political and military ramifications of having Rees around, there were huge social pitfalls too, because protocol dictated that they all attend many of the same social functions and their daily duties crossed paths during everything from routine status and synchronization meetings to grand planning sessions. Those meetings this week alone were dictating plans for the defense or conquest of 2 whole solar systems, and it was a slow week. Samson sighed tiredly, with all the weight of unfinished tasks over the last 2+ weeks crushing his soul. Got it in one, pretty lady? She sighed tiredly as well, and her smile fell off her face at the same time as the mirth fell from her eyes as she exhaled. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I did come up for a reason. Got a minute? He knew after many years with her that it was his turn to shut his mouth and listen now. Of course I do, baby. She began after a moment's hesitation that was masked by a long, unsteady, but deeply drawn breath. Well, I'm completely buried, and I have this constant pressure on my chest like I'm drowning in too deep water. There is so much crap to this head of intelligence services job that I have no idea about. They are using acronyms and code names for existing projects that are so casually tossed about in these massive data files, and I have not the first clue what they're talking about. They keep sending that crap to me like I know what the hell they're telling me, while I make decisions about things that I spend more time looking up the code names, jargon, and acronyms on those things and piecing together the meanings of the reports from the scattered context clues. And woe be me if they have 2 or more acronyms in the same sentence. You wouldn't believe how many of those stupid things have the same 3-letter spellings for completely opposite, contradictory, and/or unrelated topics. I can read a whole damn report, get to the end, and realize that I have to start all over because I was using the wrong definition for some innocuous 3-letter acronym, whatever today that changed the whole meaning of the bloody report. I had to read it all over again to make sure I understood what they were telling me. I'm really not stupid. But this dizzying crap is making me feel like I'm a completely clueless moron, because I can't even make sense out of it half the time. I need a copy of the report opened, along with an index of acronyms, and on another secure portable terminal on top of my desk terminal, I need the reference site for project names so I can pull up the background, and when I do that I have to go back to my acronym index and the bloody obtuse report half the time just so I can figure out what the hell the old background stuff is saying to me so that I can read the new stuff and now understand what the hell that new stuff is trying to tell me. Gods below, Samson, I feel like I just want to cry. He sighed his own frustrated agreement. I know exactly what you mean, love. She pulled back slightly and glared at him before she snapped irritably. No, you don't, you big liar. You don't even know how to cry. When you get frustrated, you just hack at things with a sword until you feel better. Samson replied honestly, That's true. I was actually thinking about that earlier today. Persephone sighed profoundly, exhaling her frustrations as she fell against his chest. She buried her face in his neck, wormed her hands to his ribs, and clutched at his uniform, pulling herself close so he couldn't get away. Not wanting her to get away, he draped his arms soothingly around her warm little body as she pulled her feet up under herself. She stayed ensconced like that until the annoyances started to roll into their moment. The first calm call was ignored. The second caused Samson to lean back in irritation and crush his heel to the button that would suspend the unit's incessant chirping and pinging. Samson closed his eyes and just leaned back with his wife in his arms. It was still nearly impossible for him to think of Persephone as a wife. It was almost an alien concept to the two of them. They had just always been, and now it was formal and odd. And now there was so much more swirling around them, and they still hadn't had the time to take the briefest break to acknowledge their own relationship status change. Persephone mumbled quietly past his neck, Samson? His hand traced her side as he spoke softly into her hair. Yes, little wife? Persephone looked up smiling, with her nose only an inch from his before she said, You called me wife, and she kissed him on the nose. She continued as she lay her head back down on his shoulder. "Samson, I was wondering if you would please have lunch with me today." His own stomach growled its approval at the suggestion. "That's an outstanding idea. Where do you want to go?" She mumbled into his collar, "Nowhere." He joked weakly, "Well, we have to be somewhere." She replied simply, "Here." Samson was a little confused and questioned, "You want to eat here, in my office?" She nodded her head yes against his neck, mussing the front and left side of her hair. Samson soothed her with his hand and agreed. "All right. What do you want to eat?" She took a moment. He could tell by the movement of her right-hand fingers in his uniform that she was thinking about what she wanted before she answered in a single word, "Sandwich." Samson asked with the infinite patience he reserved for very few others, "Sandwich? Any kind in particular, or something exotic and fun I haven't thought of yet?" She shook her head violently, no further tangling her hair against his shoulder. "Regular one, wrapped in paper, with a pickle and chips, and all in a plain brown paper bag." Gently pushing his limits, but only gently, not wanting to frustrate her with either a wrong snap decision or arbitrary decision, he equally gently and soothingly as he could manage asked, "Do you want a hot sandwich or cold cuts?" She spent a few seconds thinking about that before pressing her eyes to his neck and mumbling, "Cold cuts." Samson kissed the top of her head before kicking his foot up again onto the desk so he could whack the button on his comm for an audio-only connection to that annoying person who called himself assistant. The one who kept bringing all those piles of paperwork and dropping them on his desk. The same jerk who Samson could not find the time to remember his name because he was so new as his assistant that Samson couldn't have picked him out of a security force's lineup yet. Instead, he whacked the video connection by mistake and could see the fellow at a crazy acute angle on his desktop screen as he leaned back. The civilian's voice replied instantly, "Yes, sir. Are you done with those files I brought in this morning?" Before Samson could reply, he instantly switched from his goading reminder to, "What can I do for you?" Samson answered, "Lunch, actually." His assistant questioned, "This early, sir?" Samson snapped at the bait, "Yes, damn well this early. It's just past 11:30, and I've been in here since 05 this morning. It's time for some damn lunch." Samson watched the man flinch under his disappointment and obvious error. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" Samson casually announced, "Sandwiches, please." Into the briefest pause Samson remembered that not only didn't he know the fellow's name, but had never once discussed what he liked for lunch, so he had to fill in the blanks. "I want 2 sandwiches," he recited Persephone's preference exactly. "Regular sub-sandwiches, wrapped in paper, with a pickle and chips, and all in a plain brown paper bag." Persephone purred a heartfelt into his neck as she hugged him tighter to her chest as she sat folded across his lap. The assistant was polite enough to pretend he didn't hear her. Samson made note that the fellow was not only discreet, but apparently detail-oriented and exacting, qualities he made an additional note to himself to appreciate and use more in the future. He'd need to make a note to himself to stop being so snappy and irritable in his own work frustration. The man on the screen asked, "And what would you like on those 2 regular sub-sandwiches, wrapped in paper, with a pickle and chips, and all in a plain brown paper bag, sir?" Samson rattled off the first things that came to mind, as he decided to have some fun and test his dreaded bringer of paperwork. "Salami, pepperoni, Genoa or Prosciutto ham, with smoked provolone cheese, light lettuce, some tomatoes, black olives, pickled roasted sweet red bell pepper strips, red onion and green pepper slices, with olive oil and vinegar, with a little black pepper and oregano. Samson nodded in satisfaction. That request should be suitably complex to shut the smug little fellow up for a while. Persephone sat up and nodded her own satisfaction, followed by a profound hum. She whispered into his ear, "That sounds good," before falling back and away so he could talk. His assistant snaked him and bit Samson's pride hard as his attention to detail again surprised Samson. "Yes, sir. And the other sandwich?" Samson was starting to hate that guy, but grudgingly acknowledged. "No, thank you. Just make it the same for both, please." His assistant questioned, "Yes, sir. And what would you like for your chip selection? Is there anything in particular?" Samson conceded defeat to superior attention to detail, with a barely audible sigh. "No, thank you. Regular ones that come in a bag. That's all for now. Just come in when you have them." The man answered calmly, "Yes, sir." Samson realized his assistant was hanging on the line because Samson as the boss hadn't broken the connection, a piece of etiquette that he appreciated from his soldiering days when juniors never told their commanders that the conversation was over. It was just impolite. He spoke blandly, "Thank you, that's all for now," before he lifted his heel and pressed the button terminating the connection. Persephone leaned back, encircling his neck with her clasped hands, as she hung from him. "I think your little friend is trying to impress his new boss." Samson grumbled, "Yeah, well, I don't know how long I want to keep him with Thanadio's taint on him." Persephone looked puzzled. "What do you mean by that?" Samson considered. "Meaning, how can I trust the guy if he worked for Thanadio's, doing his share of Guardsman assignments?" Persephone nodded in understanding before playfully hanging from him with her left hand and tugging lightly on his ear with her right, replacing her fingers behind his neck and speaking, "He is no one's creature. Is that why you're so snippy with him? You should cut him some slack. He is as new to this job as you are. He only arrived as a replacement the day before you did. I have all of Thanadio's and Casimir's people under interrogation. We were picking them up through the initiative of our internal affairs inspectors while you were sedated in the infirmary. There is a pack of operatives from the intelligence section who disappeared and haven't checked in, but we picked up many of the analyst and support types in their homes because they hadn't moved fast enough. Others came right into work and willingly submitted to questioning, realizing they'd been duped by people they trusted. You were asleep in the hospital bed next to me when Mom and Diantha were brought in and Daddy had the Home Guard battalion commander join us, so he could send them out to round up the missing operatives with the internal affairs security personnel. He sent them on direct word-of-mouth orders to keep that stuff out of intel channels Casimir may still have tapped. Casimir seemed to have had cells set up in the intelligence section that were loyal to him. All the skill sets that he would need to disappear and run his shadow operation disappeared with him in the guise we can't find. There were some dumb ones we picked up at home, still packing. Well, I guess I should rephrase that they were not dumb. They were not field agents, like I said before, she admitted, expressing a degree of irritation, which was probably pretty dumb on our part, because now we can't use the inexperienced ones as breaches into Casimir's organization. Samson shrugged. "No, you have taken assets away from him. You can pump even the inexperienced ones, the dumb ones, and any others who've turned themselves in when they realized they were on the wrong side for information and find useful nuggets. It is better for us to have that information as soon as possible, so we never lose track of those targets in the first place." Persephone pulled close again and laid her head on his shoulder. "I suppose you're right. This is all just such a long way from my fun sneaky security breaky days of getting all dressed up and sneaking out of Daddy's house to visit my secret boyfriend for a night out on the town. Samson grumbled. Ain't that the truth? She shrugged against his chest. Now granted, sneaking out was no mean feat. I was defeating some of the best security systems and personnel in the human galaxy, but still, playing the sneaky daughter only translates so far into managing a multi-billion credit intelligence gathering operation. Samson joked, I guess we kids all have to grow up someday. Persephone grumbled, rolling her eyes, Ain't that the truth? They were both startled by the door opening in front of Samson's assistant, carrying 2 mid-sized paper bags. Samson mumbled, That was fast. His assistant nodded and answered faster than Persephone could. He answered snappily, Yes, sir. They came right up from the house kitchens with a runner. He placed the 2 bags precisely on the desk blotter because it was the only clean space, below the outbox from the far side, not rounding the desk, instead staying in front of it. Is there anything else, sir? Samson couldn't think of anything. No, thank you. That should be all for now. The man didn't even bat an eye at Persephone curled in his lap. Yes, sir. He turned and disappeared through the door. Persephone nodded her chin at the closed door. He should be good. We tested all the remaining personnel who had anything to do with Thanadios and Casimir, and nothing came up on any of them. Thanadios seems to have played things pretty close to the vest, old school style, and not brought people into his plotting. It's a little confusing why he acted like he did at the end with Alexios. Done right, that move could have been totally transparent and successful. The simplest but probably stupidest explanation was that he drank too much and lost situational awareness in his decision. Forgetting about the cameras, Casimir seems to have been more aggressive in establishing his own shadow regime and power base. If I had to guess, I don't think Uncle Thanadios would have remained in power long had he ever inherited from my mother and father. I think Casimir would have arranged for his father to have had an accident or planned for him to have a heart attack before long. He has disappeared with all the pieces he would need to do something like that too. And then there was how he treated poor Diantha on his way into hiding. What a monster! She shook her head to clear the disgusting images of her prone cousin-in-law in the infirmary bed next to Samson. Samson reminded her, Don't fret over it, love. There is nothing you can do about it right now. His somber reminder was brushed off as she happily hopped out of his lap. I know, we have lunch. She snapped out her left hand and grabbed both of the bags. Her right hand slapped over his as she pulled him from the chair. Come on, let's do something silly. She dragged him out of the chair, around the desk, to a corner, and pushed him to it, pointing to the floor. He groused at her sprightly behavior. Woman, you are so strange. She corrected, SHH. She slipped her fingers into his hand and sank to the floor, dragging him down with her, so she could sit and lean up against him as he sat in the corner to her right. We can eat like we're at home without a worry in the world. He reminded her, Persephone, we are home. She paused and spoke a little crestfallen. I meant our home in our apartment. I mean your apartment. She turned a little sad when she spoke. I meant our happy little home when everything was fun and we were just out seeing the world and enjoying ourselves, doing whatever we wanted when we wanted, and things moved to our pace. She sighed tiredly. I feel like a prisoner here. He slipped his arm over her shoulder and pulled her close to kiss the top of her head. But no one is trying to kill you here. I like knowing that you're here and safe. She sighed. I know. Maybe I'm just dying of boredom here. This place is like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Samson actually laughed out loud at that. My goofy little wife, you're so funny, I think it's time to eat. Persephone perked up instantly. Good idea, boring husband of mine. You always take the fun out of everything, you know? She tore into her sandwich bag and ripped open the sandwich. Laying the paper across her lap as she leaned on Samson's shoulder, she jammed half of the sandwich into her mouth and moaned in overly exuberant ecstasy. She exclaimed around a packed mouth, "Best lunch ever!" When Samson caught up with her, he had to agree that it was a pretty darn good sandwich, and exactly what he had ordered. Both bags were empty, and all the food was consumed before they realized they had run out. Samson stuffed the leavings and wrappers into his untorn bag, squeezed the air out, and rolled it all down tightly. As he finished, Persephone crawled into his lap and nearly passed out on his shoulder again as she purred. "Best lunch ever. I was starving," she moaned. "Now I'm full. It was great, but I usually don't like eating that much." Samson soothed. "We're working hard and haven't been eating regular meals?" He gently stroked her hair. "We needed that break and the food." She contentedly mumbled, hum, while sitting with her back to the wall and her shoulder leaning on his. She lounged near napping for a solid 30 minutes before she sighed again, slapped her hand to his thigh, and told him, "All right, you, no more playing around. Time for us to get back to work." She kissed him gently on the lips, and past her closed eyes, she sighed again, "I love you. Don't be too late tonight, please, husband." He kissed her hair. "All right, wife. I will do my best to make dinner tonight." She shook her head against his chest before pulling back and popping her hair clip. She stood shaking out her hair as she pinched the clip in her teeth and pushed every strand back in her fingers to clump and twist it before pressing her clip back to her now long but trapped hair. She sighed, "Calling you husband is so odd. I love it, but it just doesn't sound right when I say it yet." Samson shrugged, looking up at her from the floor, before working himself up the wall to stand beside her. "It sounds strange to me, too. We've just gone so long without saying it, or even hoping that we could ever say it, that now that we are able to, it's all a little confusing." She leaned heavily against him as she sighed again. "It's like this isn't even my life. It's like I'm watching some miserable person just struggling to make it day to day. I grew up here, and it's like this isn't even my home anymore. It's like an alien world." Samson mumbled, "I know exactly how you feel." She nodded, pushed away to stand on her own, trailed her hand down his arm to squeeze his hand before straightening her posture, looking up to smile at him one more time and turning to quietly leave. Once he tossed the lunch wrappers in his trash can and dropped them into his desk. The rest of the day flew by as he blinked, and it was gone. He moved a huge amount of paperwork from one side of his desk to the other, but he still felt like nothing got finished. Samson couldn't believe how many hard copy forms actually needed his real signature in this modern day and age of electronics and digital systems. They just seemed never ending, like the systems just made it easier to produce more nonsense that required more signatures, on more pointless documents, in more triple triplicates. When he tossed his pen onto the blotter, he'd been forced to pull over his touch screen to keep the pen from etching its surface. He stared at the mountain of paperwork he hadn't done and checked the time, realizing it was almost dinner time. He decided he was done for the day. He pushed back and stretched, feeling the tightness from his recent injuries that he hadn't had time to rehabilitate and work out properly, not to mention the debilitating effects of not working out at all. He cringed at the sudden thought that he might actually be getting old. He stood and stretched with his fingers interlaced over his head and felt things ripping and popping in places that they had never before. He had been neglecting his physical therapy and general fitness too much. Even with his enhanced healing, there was only so much his tiny little nanobot helpers could do for him. They were designed with specific protocols in mind, programmed into their little collective hive brain. Part of the reason that exercise, and specifically correctly balanced exercise, was so important to his ilk was that they could trick their little helper bots into thinking slovenly and out of shape was what they should become. They didn't work out for him or tear down his muscles to build him up automatically. They only worked to help his body to naturally rebuild them. What they did do was repair damage, prevent infection and chemical invasion, offer some safeguards to enhance his survivability, and accelerate natural healing based on his body's natural form and characteristics. The strengthening factor that went into Guardsman was in their denser skeletal system, which was why it was so important to begin the regimen of nano-injections when they did in the middle years of training and to prolong the process through composite additions for as many years as they did. He could train harder than a normal human because his nanobots stimulated his own fabrication of repairing proteins and then assisted in their dissemination into his muscles. He could endure more because he could train more frequently and with more intensity and duration than a normal person. He was physically stronger because his skeleton was bolstered with thicker and denser bone walls that protected his white blood cell producing marrow. Because of his augmentations, he could heal from those broken bones faster when the nanobots stitched that bone together with longer and smoother fibers. All of those millions of credits worth of augmentation, training, and work counted for nothing when a guardsman sat rotund and inert behind a desk, only gorging himself one meal a day before bed so it would go nowhere but natural fat storage. And he only hydrated with gallons of over-sweetened coffee during the day. That was a road Samson was now sprinting down by ignoring his own workout regimen. To only the remaining piles of paperwork, his desktop's blinking text message lights, and the open expanse of his voluminous office, he piped more cheerfully than he felt, "To the gym. Fatso." He capped his pen and tossed it on top of the paperwork spilling out of his inbox. "Tomorrow is another day. I am cutting this one short, and it will be even more hectic tomorrow than today." He looked around his barren office and then down to his desktop. He thumbed the standby button for the seconds required to recognize a shutdown request. His index finger grazed the pop-up requesting verification that he was actually shutting the unit down to standby, with work still open. That silly little technological annoyance was so that the machine knew that it was actually him, and not some inanimate object that had fallen by chance onto the shutdown icon in the correct sequence. The machine silently and obediently blanked to a dark desktop screen. He sighed, trying to clear the day from his mind, as he walked around the desk plucking piles of work that were scattered around his desk and trying to shuffle them into a discernible priority sequence for the next morning. He spent half a second each dithering over priority based on the time he'd had it, on the due date, sender, personal priority, or the project's overall importance. In the end, as he held hard copy files and folders between different fingers and knuckles and even up with other files, he finally just decided to drop them all into a semblance of order. He squared their corners and decided to start bearing down into them from top to bottom the next day without the additional brain power required to shuffle them into a complicated priority set. He felt his fists on his hips as he stared down at the smooth desk he hadn't seen since some time earlier that week. He heard another sigh rush out of his throat. He'd learned, what felt like 1,000 years ago, as a young lieutenant guardsman, that the more stuff piled up on the desk, the more things he could be yelled at for not turning in on time. He groused again for the 1,000th time that day, What a damn mess. How am I ever going to dig my way out of all this? Shaking his head, he just turned from the desk and wandered to the door. He pinched the bridge of his nose between his left thumb and index finger, trying to squeeze out the strain behind his eyes, and didn't even hear the automatic door open. He was grateful that he didn't walk into the corner of the door, but was startled by the sudden, "Yes, sir. What can I do for you, sir?" The man was standing at the civilian equivalent of attention and seemed vastly more eager than a 13-hour day behind a desk warranted. Samson dropped his hand and had to mentally grind gears from paper cuts and workout to interpersonal interaction. He blinked away the days before replying, "Nothing. Thank you. I'm calling it a day. I need to go work out and do some rehab. He waved his right hand nondescriptly across his body, pointing at everything that had been recently injured, and nothing in particular as he searched for the word. But it didn't come. My things are bothering me? He realized he was babbling, but he believed in sharing information and wanted to make it clear that he didn't want to be bothered by paper stuff while working on correcting health stuff. I need to work rehab into my routine, or I will not be able to perform optimally. His new assistant offered, "I understand, sir. Would you like to start at 5 tomorrow morning again?" Samson almost cringed but managed to keep his face schooled. "I haven't decided. I need to work out my best schedule. That includes a workout, a morning meal, and a reasonable start time here. Depending on how that works out over the next few weeks, I may sneak in early and get some work done before a workout and meal." The snappy reply caught him almost off guard. "Yes, sir. What time would you have me here?" 5 tomorrow morning." Samson groaned at the mention, shaking his head. No, he tried to be as reconciliatory as possible, while not having the faintest clue of what the correct answer should have been. "I don't know. Let's try 8 and see how that works out." Hesitating slightly, the man started. "But, sir, you will be here before me. You've been in by 6 every day of the week since you took residence in this office 14 days ago." Samson grudgingly admired the fellow's attention to detail and enthusiasm, but it was sort of like staring into the sun from a very near orbital. "Well, that's sort of the point. You work faster than me, and I need the time to catch up. So there's no point abusing you by keeping you sitting here at all hours waiting for me." The bland-looking but neatly maintained fellow with the impeccably combed hair and neatly kept Croyno's House Secretariat uniform dropped his chin and eyes a hair and considered for a moment before, "I see, sir." Sensing his subordinate's distress, Samson retraced his route so as not to damage the man's confidence and job performance. The last thing he needed at this point was someone fretting over being released for something as silly as being good at their job and embarrassing their boss who couldn't keep up. As stupid as it sounded, it wasn't unheard of in the corporate worlds and was a very real fear for assistants. Samson scratched his brow and began as gently as he could. "Look, I'm just learning this position. I know what things are supposed to look like, but I'm still trying to sniff out the bullshit from the actual responsibilities. I've been doing this for what? 2 weeks, you said, and I'm just now starting to get the forms and procedures familiarized. I'm still trying to hash out where all the big things are that I need to get done. I'm stuck with reading every line of every report because I don't know where they put the important stuff in all the different variations of memos, accounting, and fill-in-the-blank forms. So, look, damn it. This is what I mean. 2 weeks, I've been so buried in paper that I literally can't even remember your name. And that's a pretty big item on the list." Information flowed out. Bartholomew Grant, bachelor's degree in English, Associated Academic Fraternal Orders for Excellence as an undergraduate. postgraduate at the House Kroinos Compressed Secretariat Postgraduate course, placing 7th of 54 in my year group. I have additional schooling in sensitive document handling and public relations, and given that my last assignment was to the aging and since retired head of the Kroinos Family Leasing and Land Management Agency, I have additional, however optional, training in cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I spent my last 13 years primarily in the service of that subordinate corporate entity. Samson thought he detected a joke there, but trying to process, it was like gears grinding in his head. Samson felt his brow cock up over his eye. It was an impressive resume considering the initiative and selection processes involved, and said in such a rush that Samson figured Grant was very interested in making a strong first impression. Samson genuinely said, "Wow, all that? I didn't even know the Kroinos family had a land management agency." Bartholomew flipped his own eyes and brows up, but managed to stifle the sigh that would have otherwise escaped. "Yes, sir, there is such a thing. However, we are somewhat, and pardon the expression, maligned and neglected by the parent corporation. I regret that it is not a particularly flashy industry that draws notice and attention. However, we did manage to maintain the industry average as our floor minimum performance on all our separate properties and quarterly reports. Of the 14 properties we managed, we had 2 that were well placed and fortunately profitable, whereas the other 12 were perfectly average. The philosophy was to maintain a high level of occupancy based on price in the unremarkable properties, and the ones that were naturally in demand received the lion's share of the maintenance and attention to keep the quality high-paying tenants happy. Samson grasped and returned, "I see." Bartholomew continued to provide information. We managed just over 106.4 million square meters of marketable real estate throughout the city. Samson boggled all of a sudden and interrupted. 106.4 million square meters? I paid for a rat trap apartment not long ago in the bottom 10% of a building that ran me a few hundred credits per month for a 5 by 15 meter place. That's some cash flow. Bartholomew pinched his lips into a flashed half-smile as his eyes bulged for that moment in modest embarrassment before admitting, "Yes, sir, I'd," picking his word carefully, "heard about that. I will mention that it is a relatively unprofitable bulk residential market. Most credits are made in the top 10% of floors and with commercial concourses. I will caveat by saying you were not resident in one of the family buildings during your—" He stopped again to pick his word carefully, and Samson was amused by his attempt at discretion. "Tenure in that building." Samson had to chuckle. "You can say it between us. The word you were looking for was exile." Bartholomew corrected. "No, sir. I said what I meant. You were a resident in a competitor's building. Just because I handle paperwork flow, please don't ever assume that I'm stupid because of it. Regardless of the situation that caused it, there was much mechanization behind the scenes at very high levels at play during that episode. A common exile, as you called it, doesn't just show up on vid one day with the heiress to any corporate empire, alone, trusted with her security away from all other support and protection institutions without profound reason and trust. And you were by no means with the heiress to just some inconsequential corporate empire. You were with the heiress to the hegemony's governing corporate body, the power grid, all 3 military corporations, our research and development, along sundry other corporate entities larger and smaller than my prior posting. They replayed your fight against those mercenaries in that foundry for weeks. Never mind that our whole world, literally tens of billions of people in our city, watched you live on vid 3 Friday nights ago in what no one on the world dared question was anything but a live fight to the death, with swords no less. You did all that just so you could save the young lady who visited here for lunch today. And then that same heiress who has now somehow been attached to that same exile is not only condoned but approved of in her own home. There is something going on there that I would never care to discuss in detail without a securely shielded room between myself and the whole rest of the listening world. Samson nodded. Point taken. I'll never assume you're dumb or unaware of precisely everything that's happening in the world, and from now on I'll ask you for news first. The reply was quick with a wry smile. That's generally a good rule of thumb, sir. At the executive level, never ask the executive. Ask their assistant for something. The assistant generally has more up-to-date information available. He paused to think for a moment on what Samson supposed would be a creative alliteration that would both not offend and bluntly inform. He was not unimpressed by the stream of euphemisms, without coloration from creatively career-minded subordinates. Samson smiled at the clever delivery. Ah, so you mean managers looking to make themselves look better play with the numbers. But the good assistants will be able to sniff out the crap and find the real numbers for an executive astute enough to ask. The response was instantaneous. Got it in one, sir. Samson took a moment to consider before asking, All right, I'm going to pretend like I'm an astute executive today and ask you directly, what in the hell am I doing wrong? Why can't I get my head above water? Bartholomew actually scoffed through his nose and smirked. Do you actually want the answer to that, sir? Samson suddenly had the urge to rip the man's head off with his bare hands. Of course I want the bloody answer. Bartholomew shook his head somewhere between disbelief and frustration before answering. You answer your calm. Confused, Samson demanded, Well, why wouldn't I do that? Shaking his head with a tiredly frustrated sigh, Bartholomew asked in return, Sir, who is your boss? Offended, Samson demanded, What do you mean by that? Grant replied calmly, Simple. He spelled it out very deliberately, pronouncing each word. To whom do you report? Samson just answered like it was the stupidest question in the world. To CEO Kroinos. Militarily, the only officer with higher rank than me is General Zasfer, but we're political equals and the Guardsmen are a separate entity, however technically but loosely corporately affiliated with the Ground Forces Corporation. It was Guardsman propaganda, and he knew it. But it was so ingrained he spouted it anyway. Bartholomew prompted patiently, and the young lady who heads our hegemony intelligence section. Getting frustrated with this game, he fired back. Well, yeah, wife. Finally, thrusting to the crux of his lesson, Bartholomew reminded Samson. So the only people in the empire who have the moral, legal, or matrimonial authority over you would be the CEO, his wife as shareholder, and your mother-in-law, VP Promethean, and Miss Persephone. Those are the only 4 people you answer to in the entire hegemony. Why do you personally field calls from people other than those 4? How much time did you spend today blathering with those insipid CEOs who are renting your Guardsmen? Samson felt a spike of irritation and snapped. They aren't renting our Guardsmen. They're on detached security detail. Grant calmly offered, Sir, your trade is war. My trade and schooling are with words. Please don't mince them with me. I've read the House Kroinos individual Guardsman security detachment agreement from the first to the last letter. It's very nice, very legal, with only a few minor typographical errors that are easily corrected and will be updated and then recirculated when I have a moment. But at the end of the day, it is a lease agreement. It temporarily trades a valued commodity that the recipient does not own for credits during a fixed period of time. In this case, it is leasing high-end security coverage for an admittedly exorbitant price, as opposed to real estate, freighter space, or factory manufacturing capacity. all of which boils down to commodity, owned by the agreement's originating party, traded for cash, over a fixed but limited time period. That's a lease agreement. Bested, Samson conceded his defeat. Point taken. So, I shouldn't talk to anyone on the calm. Grant gently corrected. I didn't say that. Bartholomew's matter-of-fact delivery was like a slap in the face. Just route all your calls, other than those 4, to my desk unit. You won't have to deal with any more angry debutantes and their yappy dogs complaining about your guardsman. Suddenly curious, Samson asked, How did you know about that call? Bartholomew's eyes fluttered shut as he shook his head a minuscule distance from side to side, in his frustration and disbelief at Samson. Grant obviously recalled his own irritation at the conversation. She called back later, While Miss Persephone was in with you? You ignored her call. The calm system automatically shunts calls to me if you don't answer them. She was quite upset that. What was that drolly common and marginally offensive name she called that creature? Snookums was referred to by you as a yappy dog during your conversation with her earlier in the morning. She'd apparently festered over it for nearly an hour and a half before she whipped herself up into enough of a fervor to call back and face you down over the calm again. I couldn't tell if she was more hot and bothered over the dog, or more intent upon being hot and bothered with the fact that she had a reason to talk with you. Confused by the emphasis, Samson asks, What's that supposed to mean? Bartholomew took a moment's pause to look down and phrase his next words carefully. Samson watched him equally carefully, and then Grant spoke. Power at this level maintains a heady and seductive allure. All these upper-end types are driven by it and surrounded by it. It drives them and pulls them at the same time. They will do nearly anything to keep it, no matter how despicable or dishonorable. The COs have their offices, their staffs, their air cars, their VPS, their boardrooms, their trophy wives, oftentimes their mistress, or more than one, and more or less prioritize them in that order just so they can have and maintain those trappings of power and prestige. Samson agreed noncommittally. All right. Bartholomew calmly offered, Their women are no different. They cling to their out-of-shape breadwinners and enjoy their spas, yappy dogs, society friends, fine dining, and see-to-be-seen occasions. And now she's all hot and bothered by some, pardon the expression, but it fits in this case, unrefined field soldier who's suddenly thrust into her world. Samson objected strongly. The captain on that assignment isn't an unrefined field soldier. This is his second protection tour. He knows the ropes. Bartholomew scoffed. I wasn't talking about your guardsman. I was talking about the guardsman. She knows exactly what you are. She knows that just like the whole rest of this planet does. Remember? She's got your number and was thrilled to find a direct line to you because of your relationship with her security detail. To that woman, you're now a heady mix of gladiator warrior mixed with the ruling elite. She's got the ruling elite, but where could she go with the rest? She's got the access, skills, and motivation to play the game with you. Offended, Samson snapped. That's absurd. I'm here at the grace of House Kroinos. They could unmake me as quickly as they made me again. A second time. Getting frustrated, Samson blurted, You know what I mean? Patiently Grant explained, I understand that, sir. Do you think she cares what happens to you? And even if she does have the brains to grasp that fact along with a rudimentary ability to prior plan, she could have and probably already has decided that taking a stab at landing you would be worth her while. Even for an afternoon tryst, she'd be able to gossip and rub it into her friends' faces for a month, maybe even a quarter if she played her cards right and really exploited your dalliance. Samson groaned. These games make my head hurt. Sardonically, Bartholomew almost groaned at the truthful admission. "Get used to it, sir." He leaned over and looked at his desk's comm unit as it pinged, drawing Samson's attention too. Grant said in a casual aside, "More of the same. No need to show interest. That one was a reroute from your office. Mine just flash." He continued, "I'm no expert on the subject, having never been invited to family functions and not wanting to go in the first place, but from what I've seen from afar via publicly available vids and heard through our Kronos House Assistant back channels, I'm not sure Miss Yappy Dog grasps the magnitude of trouble she'd call down on her own head via the wrath of our new Director of Intelligence Services. I'm not a political scientist, but just the mention of that title coupled with the associated mystique of those organizations in general scares the jeepers out of me. Not to mention Miss Persephone's behaviors I've seen captured on the vid. I suspect that Miss Persephone's wrath would be somewhat catastrophic when it slammed into Miss Yappy Dog's world." Recalling with an obvious burst, Bartholomew continued quickly with a moderate shake of his eyes. "And I can't forget that Miss Persephone may have learned a thing or two from her own mother, who, while she the sweetest person on the planet, she still can manage to find a mean streak the size of an orbital defense grid, with just about as much firepower to boot." Samson groused at the accuracy. Point taken. Bartholomew shared his hard-earned wisdom. The easiest way for your integrity to be beyond reproach and to clear your desk at the same time is to severely limit access to yourself. Not to mention that limiting access increases your own power base because everyone is forced to come through you because you are the boss, but you get the option to meter their inputs to you. If they don't pester you, they can't demean you. Learning, Samson added, like those two jackass COs who blathered at me this morning. Nodding his affirmative agreement, Bartholomew spoke clearly. "Precisely. They call you, and you answer them by dancing to their tune. They have the power. If you force them to wait in the figurative antechamber with the rest of the peons, they become supplicants and need to entertain you at your will. You have the power in that relationship." A little hesitant, Samson asked, "Won't that be a headache for you?" Bartholomew answered flatly, "No." A little befuddled, Samson wondered, "Why not? It will upset them for sure." Bartholomew cut a huge lopsided grin and barked the demand. "So what? What are they going to do? Yell at me? I'll hang up on them. If they do it twice, I'll block their number. They haven't got anything on me? What are they going to do? Fire me? Who's my boss? You are? What do I care what they think? They can't exactly dock my pay. Now can they? Who's my employer? The House Kronos Secretariat and Administrative Agency. Who owns them?" Samson answered without thinking, "I don't know. I never thought about it." Grant smiled at the interruption before continuing. "Lady Selene Kronos owns us. I've never met her personally. We've discussed her briefly today, and I'm not a betting man either, but given what I've seen in my tenure, my bet is she won't tolerate any nonsense from customers berating her employees." Samson agreed. "True." He thought for a moment, and Bartholomew was astute enough to realize Samson was thinking things over and remained silent before listening. How do we clear all this stuff off my desk and restore some semblance of sanity to this job? Bartholomew scratched his nose and then turned to fiddle with some stacks of work that would surely appear on Samson's desk tomorrow. Samson watched him carefully as Bartholomew obviously inventoried things on his desk and checked his own digital desktop with a glance before answering, "If you filter route your calls, keep working at the pace you've been setting, and nothing explodes in our faces, you should be cleared of the worst of this mess within 3 weeks, a month at the outside." Curious, Samson asked, "That long?" Bartholomew sighed, showing a slice of his own frustration. "Sir, From what I understand, the High Commander position was held by CEO Kroinos for quite some time as something of a hobby. He delegated much of it to his deceased brother, who did a better than fair job of assignments. However, the flip side is that there seems to be a number of Guardsman administrative, economic, and for lack of a better word, political functions that were farmed out to various other offices and either routed to CEO Kroinos for his signature or were shuffled off into a holding pattern along the lines of it will keep until it's an emergency. That's not how I run my desk, sir. Samson agreed. Me either. That's why it galls me that I have paperwork sitting on my desk at the end of the day. Nodding, Bartholomew calmly announced, "Good. We'll get along then." Bartholomew paused while he pointed both hands palms down and out encompassing a large swath of desk piled high with bulk paperwork. Buried in this seems to be everything from student evaluations to academy tuition supplements from Kroinos Generation and the Ground Forces Corporation to building maintenance records for the academy itself, to what appears to be advanced weapons training schedules for various ranges and facilities, none of which I've ever seen or personally have any idea whatsoever as to their meaning. I could look up the acronyms, but to me, right now, it is just an alphabet with numbers soup. Samson interrupted and chimed in happily. Good. Something I'll understand finally. Bartholomew offered, I hope so, sir. Bartholomew waved his hands in a little marginally decisive gesture. The things that appeared the most pressing I have shuffled to you. Basically, the things that are required to keep the lights on and people fed with definite timers on them, or they are from someone with more rank than you, made it to your desk first. The rest we will just have to bore into as time permits. Grant offered, You get the comm filter set up tomorrow, sir, and we will be able to start dispatching these bulk items. Samson asked, How do I do that? Halting, Grant wondered, Do what? Samson asked, Filter my comm. Waving his hands before his chest with splayed fingers, Bartholomew corrected, Never mind. I'll take care of it tomorrow when I get in. I'll prioritize the 4 big numbers. Then as we work and refine who the good ones are from the panes in the rear, we can set priority filters from me to you. Samson asked, How do you mean? Grant remembered and apologized. Sorry, I forgot that you're not from the executive career track. Offense not intended. It's a jargon-style statement of fact and training. Basically, people will call you repeatedly. Some will be important, and when I know they are useful conversations and you're not with anyone in your office, I'll shunt them through directly. Others I'll screen out completely or partially, either answering them from my desk or moving them along until I'm sure they need your attention. Some will be so important that we will break them through to you directly no matter what or who is in your office. For now, that would be the CEO and Lady Kroinos, VP Promethean, and Lady Persephone. We can always add more to that list later, but for now, I think it would be very foolish to exclude any of those 4. Samson accepted, agreed. That sounds like good advice. Grant responded, Thank you. Sir, you are already processing paperwork slightly faster than you were. I can't imagine how jarring it must be for you to suddenly be dropped into all of this. We were both handed a substantial mess, but as we find our way and become familiar with the forms and protocols, our efficiency will improve. Turning resolute, Samson gently countered, I hope so. I'm not a fan of leaving work unfinished. Samson straightened his posture and felt an irritating twinge in his collarbone where his bones had been crushed together during his fight. His back was also stiff and sore, foretelling a difficult evening workout at light weights just to warm up and rebuild mobility and basic tone before restoring strength. All right, Mr. Bartholomew Grant, I am going to restart my doctor-ordered therapy. I won't forget your name again. Tomorrow is a new day, and I intend to approach it rested, fed, and after a nice physical workout to start the day." Grant acknowledged. "Thank you, sir. I will see you tomorrow, which is Wednesday, by the way, a bureaucrat's least favorite day of the week. Next to the flurry of insanity that seems to arrive on all Friday afternoons just before everyone else is quitting time, as everyone remembers something that's due the following Monday, and they need to squeeze it in before we all leave for the weekend." Grant cracked a modest smile and continued his bureaucrat joke. "And we don't like first days back from long weekends, when everyone has finally remembered, or got yelled at for, all the things they forgot to do before the weekend started." Samson narrowed his eyes and asked, "Mr. Grant, did I detect sarcasm?" Grant offered with smoothly polished sarcasm, "That would be inconceivable, sir. Sarcasm is not in my job description, so I wouldn't dream of adding it to my workday. Good night, sir." Samson felt his head recoil, lips pinch, and left eye pull closed a little at that last sarcastic quip before he shook his head and said simply, "Good night, Mr. Grant."
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.